Hello everybody. Today we have decided to have a talk on criticism and literary theory, because the purpose is to benefit most of our BA English students, and because most of our BA English students study literature as well as linguistics, we have decided to now switch over to talking about criticism and literary theory. You all are familiar with literary theory, and you have been talking about it, you have been discussing about it, and presumably you know a great deal about literary theory. But I, having been a student of science, I believe in proceeding systematically, and so would I desire all of you to be like, means proceeding systematically or methodically. If we proceed systematically or methodically, the first thing that comes to somebody's mind is, what do we exactly mean by the word theory? If it's literary theory that we are going to talk about, what is it that we mean by the word theory? A theory, it might to some sound harrowing or frightening or scaring, but it isn't that scaring at all. A theory is nothing but a set of ideas proposed by reasoning from known facts. A set of ideas proposed by reasoning from known facts to explain something. The purpose was to explain literature, because it's literary theory that we are talking about. And if it's literary theory, the theory should be able to say something about literature. It seems that to comment on our environments seems to be natural to man. Since the earliest of times, you will study in due course of time, maybe in your next semesters, criticism and literary theory. The old Greeks, they also wanted to know a great deal about literature and literary theory. And the first renowned critic, the first prominent critic that we have is Aristotle. Aristotle, in Greek days, he began to comment on literature, I would say, but more particularly, more specifically on drama, because his sole interest was in tragedy. And the book that he wrote, that we keep talking about as the first remarkable, authentic book on criticism, the first remarkable, authentic book on criticism was Aristotle's Poetics. And the word poetics, apparently, of course, the book seems to deal with drama. It does deal with drama, and more particularly with tragic drama, but it says something about nature of literature in general. So critical theory, in fact, is not something that harrowing. It is simply the opinions of the people whom we believe to have been great brains in the social milieu of different ages. Great brains, whatever they had to say about literature, that constituted literary theory, because it's actually opinions of the educated people, opinions of the highly knowledgeable, highly enlightened people that we begin to call a theory. Literally, if you look up the word in a dictionary, you could even say a theory is an opinion or a supposition, ideas or suppositions in general, as contrasted with practice. And this reminds me that if we begin to talk about theory actually has its origin. Today we talk about theory, but theory has its origin in criticism. And the word criticism, if we use this word criticism, the first thing that comes to your mind is, and I believe that you all must have been facing this problem, when you read a certain literary work, the problem that comes to your mind is how to interpret this literary work. Interpretation isn't that easy or that straightforward all the time. I was going through a poem by Robert Frost the other day. The old dog looks backward and barks. A very short 2-line poem. The old dog looks backward and barks without getting up. And I can remember the time when he was a pup. Now, you all know the meanings of different words in these 2 lines. The old dog looks backward and barks without getting up. And I can remember the time when he was a pup. But when it comes to interpretation, after all, what is it that an extremely renowned poet, almost if he had not been in America, we would have called him poet laureate, because calling the most prominent national poet laureate is a tradition of the British. In America, they don't call their most prominent poet laureate. But Robert Frost, a prominent poet because, if I remember correctly, and I think I do, he was the man who read poetry when John F. Kennedy's presidential tenure got inaugurated. When John F. Kennedy, the youngest American president in American history, when he took over, Robert Frost recited his poetry. The way other people, have been reciting their poetry on different occasions, on different important occasions. But Robert Frost's poetry, apparently simple. How do we interpret these simple? Apparently, this apparent simplicity at times is extremely intriguing, difficult to unravel, difficult to unfold. So criticism, in fact, basically, primarily focuses on interpreting literary works. When you read a poem, when you read a story, when you read a novel, you begin to try to interpret it. And I keep talking about relativity. Relativity means I shall be interpreting a literary work according to my own individual light. Individual light means the ability or the capability that I have. Somebody else, who has had better schooling, better training than I have had, he is likely to interpret it in a different way. But these are things that we shall be talking about later on. The first thing that comes to somebody's mind when he reads a literary work is interpretation, how to interpret it. And then the second thing that seems to be in vogue these days in literary circles, that is analyzing literary productions. How to analyze a literary work. And then once you have been able to do that, how to classify which particular canister or container to put it in. इस वाली पोएम को मैंने कौन सा लेबल लगाना है, किस डब्बे के अंदर इसको डालना है, इसको सोनेट कहना है, ओड कहना है, एलेजी कहना है, एपिक कहना है, क्यों और कैसे कहना है. And then you begin to talk about its different ingredients, analyzing and classifying. But all this is done with a view to be able to evaluate that literary work. The purpose is to be able to evaluate that literary work because it's literature. And right in the beginning, before we proceed, the second important word that should come to our mind and that you should be very clear about is literature. Literature, after all, what is literature? I remember once at the time of orientation in Murray College, different people, when MA students join their Part 1 class, all the MA students, they are gathered in the hall, and all HODs, economics, political science, Islamiyat, Urdu, English, they all begin to try and introduce them to their respective subjects. Those who were studying economics, they of course talked about economic matters, money and its management. Those who were interested in political science, they were introduced to running a country, the systems, political systems, and so on. And I remember when I had to say something, I said, well, literature is about man. And if you ask me, what is literature about? Literature is about man. And I hasten to add, literature is about man with a capital M. And when I say man with a capital M, I mean to say it's about human species. It's about human species. But human species do not happen to exist in the vacuum. We are not existing in a vacuum. We do not exist in the ether. We happen to be living in human societies. We are all living in human societies. We have a social milieu, which British, call media, but the Americans prefer to pronounce it as milieu. Our environments, everything that surrounds us is our environment. Now, it seems to be programmed in human psyche to try and say something about things around. Even in caves, Ajanta in India, they have discovered, caves that are said to be about 4,000 to 5,000 years old. 4,000 to 5,000 years old. And let me remind you that all human history, recorded human history, is about 5,000 years old. These great prophets that we talk about Abraham, we talk about Moses, we talk about Jeremiah, usko Urdu mein unko kehte hain. All these great prophets, if you go back, they existed, 2,000, 3,000 years ago. So all recorded human history is 5,000 years. And those caves, they have discovered in Ajanta in India, they have in those caves paintings of animals and birds. Paintings and animals of animals and birds on the walls of those caves. It means that something is there in human nature that induces us, that impels us, that compels us, that forces us, that obliges us to say something about our environment. And this is what Aristotle, only a little while ago, I was talking to you about Aristotle's theory of imitation. Aristotle believed that it's in human nature to imitate environments. Imitation doesn't mean copying, Imitation, the concept of imitation in Aristotle, by the way, isn't imitating things, the way we say, well, somebody was imitating me or copying me. It wasn't that. Imitation in Aristotle, it has creative connotations. Means if you're trying to say something about something, using your imaginative faculty, using your aesthetic sense that you have been endowed with, then you are imitating. So imitating, all human beings imitate. If you look around, if you go to villages, you notice that people who do not happen to be educated, even they try to compose and recite poetry. They try to compose and recite poetry. It means, and that is why probably Sidney, when he talks about poetry and he tries to defend poetry, he says that poetry is even older than history. Means people started recording human history later. The first thing that people could do in the ancient times, the most ancient, if I could say, times, that was composing poetry. It means that imitating, saying something about what surrounds us is in the nature of man. So this is literature, saying something. But everything that comes to us in writing doesn't happen to be literature. If you have small booklets, on your microwave oven, that is also literature. It's a small manual that tells you about the different faults that are likely to develop or different defects that are likely to, yes, even a small booklet on a new car is car literature. Or even a medical rep, comes to you with literature. Literature literally means alphabets, anything that is written. But the literature that we are talking about is writing that has an aesthetic aspect. Aesthetic. Aesthetic, if you look up these words, in good dictionaries, good lexicons, you will come to know that aesthetics has something to do with beauty. And by the way, art, all art has to do with beauty. If you say somebody is very artistical or very artistic, what does it mean? It means that he takes care to, make himself look beautiful. He takes care to make his room, his surroundings look beautiful. He takes care to make his car look beautiful, artistic, and he takes care to make his conversation, communication beautiful. That is artistic. So the word art, literature, please keep in mind the fact before we proceed further in the realm of criticism and critical theory, literature is art. And all art is nothing but creation of beauty through the use of your imaginative faculties. When you use your imagination, when you use your brains in the manner of a poet, I say in the manner of a poet because scientists and artists both use their intellectual or imaginative faculties. Both make use of their imagining ability. Scientists as well as artists. But how do the two differ? Another topic we'll take up later on. But you know this much. Even at this stage of your studies in BS, you know that an artist uses imagination to create beauty. When you are making use of your intellectual faculties to create beauty, you are an artist. And if you are using your intellectual faculties to unearth, to unravel, to ferret out, to find out the truths of nature that are scattered all around us, then you are proceeding in the manner of a scientist. Okay. So literature, criticism, in fact, aims at evaluating works of literature. Criticism aims at evaluating works of literature. And literary theory, as we have already seen, nothing but a statement of the principles on which a subject is based. A statement of the principles on which a subject is based. These are the opinions of different enlightened people, intellectuals, educated people. If Aristotle says, well, this is what a tragedy has got to be like, what he says, it's his opinion, maybe based on facts, which according to him were facts. And because we all accept him as a scholar par excellence, a great brain, what he said about the nature of literature became a theory for us, sort of. In olden times, the word theory was not in fashion. The word theory, it is in fact, criticism that evolved into theory. Criticism that evolved into theory. Theory. Or it was around the second half of the 19th century or 20th century that people stopped using the word criticism too much, and the word theory became in fashion. But theory, let me tell you, is anchored in, rooted in, has its origin in, theory has its origin in criticism. It has its origin in criticism. Now, different people having different opinions. Aristotle, though he happened to be Plato's pupil, he differed with him. Sometimes we do differ. Even a pupil or a student or a taught is likely to have a different opinion. And two very close literary geniuses, they are also likely to have different opinions. I remember something of recent origin. comparatively. Wordsworth had a different opinion about diction, different from Coleridge's opinion. Coleridge had a different opinion. Wordsworth believed that poetry has got to be in the language of the rustics, ordinary people, so that ordinary people can understand. Coleridge maintained that poetry, because it's an art, it has to have something to please people. It has to have something to provide enjoyment, happiness, pleasure to the people. So it has got to be somewhat elevated. It has got to be somewhat sublime. इसमें रफ़त होनी चाहिए. पोइट्री की जो लैंग्वेज है दूसरी लैंग्वेज से थोड़ी ऊंची होनी चाहिए. तो डिफरेंट ओपिनियंस हैं. ये ओपिनियंस की हिस्ट्री है, कोई कन्फ्यूजन की बात नहीं है. देखना यह है कि व्हाट हैड डिफरेंट ब्रेन्स in different ages when the social milieu was different. If we talk about Greek milieu, the Greeks, they had a different social milieu, because you all, being students of literature, you all know that they were pagans. They did not believe in the divine religion. Divine religion that was there in those days was Judaism. Christianity was not there, Islam was not there. So they did not believe in any of the divine religions. They believed in paganism. And what was paganism? Even these great Greek scholars, they believed in gods and goddesses. And on these grounds, Plato, he said, well, poets, when he gave you his sketch of an ideal republic, when he gives you a book, an ideal republic, he tells us what an ideal republic should be like. And he inter alia means दूसरी चीज़ों के अलावा, बशमूल दूसरी चीज़ों के. एक बात जो वो कहता है कि अच्छी मसाली रियासत के अंदर शायरों को नहीं होना चाहिए. Why? Because they tell lies. They tell lies. They talk about things which do not happen to be present. It's all poetry, all creation of their imagination. The things that they talk about do not happen to exist. But on the other hand, it's something extremely interesting, because all Greek philosophers, they attached importance to ideas, not to physical things. To them, reality existed in the realm of ideas. Reality existed in the realm of ideas. And incidentally, if you have time to spare, you use your internet. Do use your internet to find out what reality is all about. What do we mean by reality? Is this dais a real thing? Is this mobile a real thing? Is this marker a real thing? We think they are real. We think they are real. But the real is the one they believed. A thing that does not decay. Thing within inverted commas. Because it was something that does not decay. A thing that does not decay, does not diminish, does not disappear, remains. It is truth, reality. And what is it that stays, that does not disappear with the passage of time? It is ideas. So the Greeks attached importance to ideas. Aristotle said that even if you have the feeling that they are talking about lies, they are talking about, Plato said, they talk about things that they can see and observe. They can see and observe. They are inferior people. And they even go to the extent of blaspheming the holy beings, that is deities, their deities, pagan deities. So Plato, he opposed Aristotle, and Aristotle said, no, poets are not to be looked down upon. They are not to be looked down upon, because what do? They in fact, enable us to have a glimpse of the things that ordinary people cannot visualize. They enable us to have a glimpse of those things. So his concept of imitation was creative. So my point is that this is where criticism originated, talking about literature. giving their respective opinions about literature. This was criticism. It doesn't mean coming out with derogatory statements about something. Criticism doesn't mean ridiculing something. Criticism doesn't mean a literary context particularly. Criticism doesn't mean debunking something. No, criticism means judging, evaluating, assessing. You talk about negative as well as positive aspects of a work. And this is what criticism is all about. Interpretation, analysis, classification, and ultimately judgment of works of literature. This is what criticism is. But later on, if you take up one particular literary work and start analyzing it, start commenting on it, you are in the field of practical criticism. But if you are trying to propound certain principles that relate to all literature, certain general principles that may be made use of while reading or evaluating literary works, that would be theoretical criticism. So one distinction that we can make right at the start is practical criticism and theoretical criticism. But sometimes some people believe that if you are studying a poem and you begin to talk about it, you are simply talking about one poem. This is descriptive criticism. But some of the scholars, unconsciously, they begin to say, well, this is the way this poem is, but this is how it should have been like. If you say things like that, you are in the realm of prescriptive criticism. Prescription different from description. So today's our talk is about literary theory, and my viewpoint is that literary theory, of course, we have now started calling it theory, but it is anchored in, it has its origin in literary criticism. Literary criticism. The aims and conventions of literary criticism, the aims and conventions. What are the aims? What are the conventions of literary criticism? They have changed over time. They have changed. I remember a beautiful essay written by a renowned American critic. A renowned American critic, M.H. Abrams. He came out with a book in, if I remember correctly, 1953. And the book is The Mirror and the Lamp. It is available in all good libraries. You might find it even if you Google, you could get a glimpse of the book, or even read it if you feel like. The Mirror and the Lamp. The very first chapter of that book, and the very first chapter of this book is titled Orientation of Critical Theories. Orientation of Critical Theories. In that book, he talks about the different approaches, and this is significant, the different approaches that you could adopt, while studying literary works. He tries to explain his viewpoint with the help of a very simple diagram. He puts the literary work in the center. If you draw a triangle, and if this is where the work is, literary work, this will be the universe, this will be the audience, and this will be the writer. Because maybe not all of you can read it, let me explain it to you once again. A literary work say a novel or a drama or a poem, you put it in the center. And at one corner, you have the writer or the artist. At the other corner of the triangle, you have the universe. And at the third corner, you have the audience. His theory was that these are the three different approaches that an artist can adopt. Means his work will either be imitating the universe, and he called it mimetic, M-I-M-E-T-I-C, mimetic theory. Means something that I have already talked about, because Aristotle and Plato, they believed that artists, what do? They imitate. Imitation, mimetic. Mimesis से mimetic निकला, इसके माने है नकल करना, imitation. This could be one approach, that maybe you have got to talk about things that surround me, my social milieu, everything that surrounds me or everything that is likely to befall human beings that would constitute the universe. For instance, the poet too happens to be a human being. He's likely to die, he's likely to fall ill, he's likely to contract, friendships. He's likely to be pleased by the sight of trees and birds and animals. And these days he is even likely to be pleased by machines and gadgets like this one. A lot of literature is available even on machines these days. It means that we have got to say something about things that surround us. This is one approach. This is mimetic theory. That this is what artists do. And another theory is that an artist, his sole concern is not talking about things that surround him. His sole concern is to express his own emotions. To express his own emotions. And maybe you have read this much of literature as yet. Wordsworth, you know Wordsworth. You all have read, Wordsworth's Daffodils. Whenever on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. You have read it. Notice the use of the first person pronoun. Whenever on my couch I lie. Romantic attitude. Whenever on my couch I lie. In a pensive mood, in a mood to relax, the daffodils begin to be there in my mind's eye. I can look at them and I can draw pleasure from that spectacle. This is it. So he says that whenever on my couch I lie, my heart is filled with pleasure. So Abrams is of the opinion that the artist is in fact, giving vent to his own emotions, as if he were trying to unburden himself, feeling light. That could be one approach, but there were others. All these romantic poets of the early 19th century, Wordsworth, Byron, Shelley, Keats, and later on Browning and Matthew Arnold, among others, they all believed in expression of the self, because they thought that this is what literature was all about. But another approach, according to Abrams, is that literature could be pragmatic in its nature. Pragmatic means it has to have a corrective impact or influence on those who read it or listen to it, being read or recited. So it has to have a pragmatic. Literature should please as well as instruct. Literature should teach as well as instruct. And the most important critic who advocated, this theory was a Renaissance critic. You are all familiar with him, Philip Sidney. Sidney 16th century, around the end of the 16th century, Philip Sidney, he began to voice the same opinion that literature has got to teach as well as delight. So, Abrams' point of view regarding the nature of criticism is that any three of these approaches would be there, in a literary work. And he is in fact, trying to cope with the variety of approaches that were available in his day, that is beginning of, or the first half of the 20th century. First half of the 20th century. But later on, what happened was, in the 17th century and in the 18th century, neoclassical ideals got into vogue. But even during the Renaissance, by the way, one prominent feature of the period of Renaissance, that is 15th and 16th centuries in Britain, but in Europe, 14th century. It seems to start in the 14th century. And then it matured or blossomed in Britain in the 15th and the 16th centuries, Renaissance. And Renaissance, by the way, the very term indicates is revival of interest in the writings of the past masters. Revival of interest in the writings of the past masters means that once again people began to consider past great ones great. They conceded their greatness and began to go by their propounded rules and regulations regarding the nature of literary works. It means they were at the same time trying to be original, creative, and that is why we say that this period is extremely interesting, because countercurrent seems to be going on in the same period. Some people interested in classical perfection and simplicity and exactness and balance and proportion, but at the same time there were people who were interested more in being original and creative and experimenting with things. They were in fact, more likely to experiment with things. So you get two countercurrents, but attaching importance to this attitude was there. In the 17th century, about 100 years that followed Renaissance, you have the same, trend going by rules and regulations propounded by the ancient masters, and it became extremely clear in the 18th century. 18th century means this, you all know, being students of literature, this is the age of neoclassical writers, when people once again began to talk about, take interest in the writings of the Greek and Roman masters, and laid a lot of emphasis on rules. You have all read, or if you haven't, you will be reading it in due course of time in your BS syllabus, Pope's essay on criticism. And therein he not only talks about rules, he also talks about availing yourselves of the beauty of nature and copying it. Nature. He lays a lot of emphasis on nature. But again, the tendency to follow the ancients. Rules, neoclassical attitudes means classical attitudes. Neoclassicism means naya classical ravaya. New means new. But after that, in the 20th century, you have a variety of critical opinions. In the 20th century, you have a variety of critical opinions, and that is when we begin to call it literary theory. Because we seem to have spent some time now, we'll continue this discussion when we meet again. My discussion of criticism and literary theory will continue when we meet again, and hopefully we'll be meeting again very soon. Thank you very much.